8-mark question. So with reference to figure 1 and extract A, examine 2 likely causes of the income inequality within the UK. Now, we've already had a read of extract A, and I believe when I was scanning through it, it gave a lot of the reasons. So I'm probably just going to have a quick look at extract A again and try to find some reasons. Okay, so let's have a scan of extract A, and it said also figure 1. So there are a number of different reasons for this. First, labour in poor places tend to develop too few skills with a lack of education. So that is definitely going to be one of my reasons, because that is a decent paragraph I can write on that. And remember the question wanted 2 reasons for the income inequality. So number 1 is going to be lack of education. Then secondly, there is a lack of infrastructure. So that is all I pretty much need for my 2 paragraph points. But of course I'm going to come back to get the application, since 8-mark question there are 2 marks reserved for application. Also, this last line is quite good for evaluation. It's easier to improve schools than persuade businesses to move to a poorer part of the country. Now, although you probably only care about this for exams, this is real life, and as someone from the north, it definitely holds true compared to the south. So let's take these 2 reasons, and let's start with the first reason, which is lack of education. So that's going to be the start of, that's going to be a point, and then how are we going to lead that? How are we going to end up with that leads to increasing income inequality? And with lack of education, I'm just going to give this example. So 21% compared to 41% in London went to higher education. So why does the lack of education in the north, and like I said, I've just quoted, there's a 20% difference between Rotherham and London students going into under 18-year-olds going into higher education. Just lack of education, of course, would lead to a lower level of human capital. Essentially, the individual has a lower level of skills, and if this individual has a lower level of skill, his skill set is smaller than someone from the south. Therefore, this worker is defined as being less productive. As a more skilled worker is likely to produce more output, and remember, how do we define productivity? It's output per unit time. And if this worker is less productive, how is that going to affect his wages? As this worker has a low level of skills, he's less productive. This means he has lower bargaining power, thus leading to lower wages. As a lower skill set means you're more easily replaced. There's lots of supply of low skilled workers, thus meaning you cannot demand as high wages as firms, instead of hiring you, will just hire 1 out of the 1,000. For example, McDonald's workers. If a McDonald's worker wants a higher wage, they will, instead of giving him a higher wage, they'll just hire 1 out of the 1,000 people in the line for the McDonald's job, since the level of skills are low, so it's easily replaced. And this, of course, leads to increased income inequality. Since the question specifically does ask us to reference both these figures, I'm going to have a quick look at figure 1. So this tells us the regional gross disposable household per income, gross disposable household income per capita, and it shows the north, of course, having lower levels, whereas the south having higher levels. So I'm just going to quote probably a figure from here. Now, this may seem overkill for an 8-mark question, especially just for 1 paragraph, but if you've done the work, if you've put in the time, you've mastered the content, this will just flow very easily, and you'll be able to write this in maybe 2 minutes. So the only thing that's going to take you a bit more time is finding the application. So 100%, you can write a bit less for this first paragraph, but I think this works. It's a very logical step-by-step chain of analysis. But yeah, let's move on to the second paragraph, which is on lack of infrastructure. And just before we move on to the second paragraph, with evaluation, I would just mention time lag. At the end of this extract, it mentions Mackenzie argues that improving education is crucial even if the returns are not immediately obvious. So I would use that, a bit of application, and then phrase that into the evaluation point, so the way I'd word it. However, in evaluation, this depends on the investment into education in the UK, in the north for example, depends on the time lag. As the extract states, the positive effects of investment into education will take time to become apparent in the economy. So even if the UK is investing now into education in the north in the short run, it will take time for its positive effects to be apparent in the economy. Okay, so for the second paragraph, with lack of infrastructure, of course, for the bit of application, I am probably going to use this. 28% of total public expenditure was spent in London, which is obviously quite a good start. And of course, earlier we did actually talk about the Gini coefficient value, which of course does represent the different levels of income inequality within a country. So that's also a great value to use. But how would I word this paragraph? So lack of infrastructure. So what does lack of infrastructure lead to, which causes income inequality? Of course, there's lots of things it leads to, but one of the main things it disincentivizes is business investment. As if you remember back to the globalization topic, one thing we say with FDI is when FDI comes in, for example, BT coming into India, what do they usually do? They improve the infrastructure, they improve the roads, the surrounding area for them to, of course, be able to operate in an efficient manner. But the reason why in the UK businesses do not invest into the north is due to the lack of infrastructure. So a great example I used to mention in my life classes is the north versus the south motorway links. So the south has much more links to motorways than the north. This leads to shorter transport times, and if there's shorter transport times, it leads to lower costs. Whereas in the north, you have less access to motorways, more access to air roads, which are slower, for example, lower speed limit, they have less connections to different parts of the country. Thus, like I said before, higher transport times, higher logistical costs. So when a firm is looking to set up shop, when a firm is looking to get established somewhere, it is much more likely to set up shop somewhere in the south, somewhere along the M1 to M6 corridor, since if it needs to deliver goods, if it needs to transport anything, they can get straight onto the motorway. So there's much faster logistical, much faster transport time, and therefore much lower logistical costs. Whereas in the north, of course, it's going to take these firms longer to transport, increase costs, therefore disincentivizes these firms to invest. And if there's less firms investing into the north, of course, there's less jobs in the north, and of course meaning that it leads to income inequality. And that's pretty much how I would write up the entire point. I'm not going to read that entire thing out, well I might. So increased transport time, increased transport costs, firms are less likely to invest, less job creation, thus worsen income inequality. Now if your first evaluation point is what we mentioned, you don't even need a second evaluation point, but if you have good timekeeping, you have a bit more time, 100% you can write a second evaluation point here. I would say, however, in evaluation, the poor infrastructure in the north leading to worsened income inequality is dependent on technological change. As due to the UK's exports primarily service-based, a lot of this is available to do online, thus it stops the geographical immobility that the lack of infrastructure causes in the north. Thus meaning individuals living in the north can work remotely for firms in the south, thus reducing that level of income inequality. You say how in evaluation, improving infrastructure it may have an opportunity cost, may not be the most effective way to increase the levels or improve the levels of income inequality in the UK, as it may be better to improve schooling as mentioned in the extract. But yeah, with your 8-mark question, of course, very simple, 2 marks evaluation, you really do not need much. And yeah, that is more than enough for the 8-mark question, and that would get you 8 out of 8.